At the dawn of our nation, women were the silent backbone supporting the men who would become the founding fathers of our country. American women continually made sacrifices, giving up their time, effort, and motivation solely to benefit our republic. Famously, Abigail Adams wrote to her husband while he constructed the American Constitution, "I desire you would remember the ladies, and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors." Despite this, he would not heed her request to have women written into the Constitution. This showed women that they need to fight for themselves and take a stand, which in turn attributed to the start of the conversation about alcoholism and domestic abuse against American women in the 1800s. Little known to the women at the time, but this conversation would lead to the creation of the women's suffrage movement. After the success of gaining the 18th Amendment into the Constitution, empowered women turned their attention to focus more on progressing their equality, rights, and representation they had in America. Because of this shift in focus, they continued their fight for equal rights for decades to come, even after the passing of the Prohibition Act. This is why Prohibition did not prohibit the continuation of women's rights. Alcohol consumption in the 1800s was drastically different than how it is today. In the early 1800s, every adult consumed an average of 5 gallons of alcohol every year. Looking at today's society, the average U.S. adult consumes 2 gallons of alcohol every year. With such a drastic difference, today, somebody who consumes 5 gallons of alcohol a year would be considered a heavy drinker or even an alcoholic, yet in that time period it was seen as normal. Referencing the early 1800s, historian W.J. Rorabaugh wrote in his book, The Alcoholic Republic, "Americans drank at home and abroad, alone and together, at work and at play. Americans drank before meals, with meals, and after meals. They drank while working in the fields and while traveling across half a continent." This also shows exactly how much Americans really drank at the time period and how it was seen. Though it was mostly used for leisure at first, Americans also began to develop a dependency on alcohol. Men at work who endured long, back-breaking hours of labor would turn to alcohol to help deal with their struggles. It got to a point where there would be rum barrels on every street corner, and many workplaces had up to 3 rum breaks a day. This created even more unsafe working conditions and allowed alcoholism to become much more prevalent. This unsafe environment soon leached down to the families of these workers who would abuse their wives and children. And sadly, it wasn't uncommon for these cases of domestic abuse to be ignored because of the way that alcoholism was culturally viewed at the time, as well as the fact that the abuse of women was not seen as deplorable in America at that time. While men were working at these labor-intensive jobs that encouraged a dependency on alcohol, women were left with more time as jobs from the Industrial Revolution increasingly took away duties that were traditionally held by women, like making clothes and food. With this newfound time and the emergence of a wide middle class, women began to organize into groups and socialize. The conversation between these women would eventually reveal their shared experiences with abuse. Without the opportunity to speak with other women about their experiences, the issue may not have even come to light, but because of the mass number of women who were sharing their experiences, these socialization groups soon turned into women's unions. This being said, groups that allowed women to share common experiences and speak up were not the only thing to inspire women to join unions. Religion was another one of the major factors that would contribute to the formation and mass growth of women unions. In Protestant Christian views, it was generally thought that to be pure in God's eyes, one was to not drink alcohol. This religious stance eventually caused part of why alcohol consumption was seen as negative. As the idea of prohibition became more popular, men who were known as heavy drinkers began to be seen in a more critical light, especially by those who were Protestant. Sarah Batterson, a professor at the University of New Hampshire who specializes in women's history, American history, and other topics, gave insight to alcohol's place in religion in the 1800s.
But yeah, so the medicinal aspect of alcohol, and it's a really good carrier. You know, if you're going to put herbs and things in there, alcohol will preserve it longer. Long story to say, you know, it was a big part of health, as well as, you know, this concern about domestic violence, which did exist, and, you know, the loss of life in factories and all that sort of thing. And, you know, they talked about sort of a, a fuzzy brain, you know, you want to have a clear brain in order to sort of be able to function, but then also receive the word of God and that kind of thing. So,
Though Protestants and women in unions already had some overlap, the majority of people very quickly saw that they had the same general goal of abolishing alcohol use in America, so they combined to better reach that shared goal. This gave rise to the creation of more powerful unions like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, founded in Hillsboro, Ohio in 1873. With their newly combined forces, the idea of purity, temperance, and prohibition quickly became widespread, eventually becoming so popular that it gained enough support from women across the country to get the 18th Amendment passed. With the success and passing of the Prohibition Act, women all across America took joy in the fact that they had made a long worked for impact on the United States. They were empowered by the knowledge that women could successfully make social progress and had no intention of having the implementation of the Prohibition Act stop them from continuing to make reforms for women's rights. The strong female leaders of women's unions then looked to tackle other social issues. Many of these women were also fierce abolitionists, but when it became obvious that they needed to focus on only one political movement at a time to be victorious, unions became solely focused on gaining the right to vote, which they later achieved with the passing of the 19th Amendment, making it the first amendment in the United States Constitution to give a woman rights. Women have achieved so much in American history, but it all started with the Prohibition Act inspiring women to make more progress with their equality. Without the Prohibition movement, America's society as a whole would be extremely different from what it is today. Today, American women have voting rights, reproductive rights, and rights to equal pay, all because of women throughout our history fighting for not just their equality, but equality for generations of women to come. Altogether, the first thing that these pioneers of women's rights focused on was the issue of alcohol in our country, which not just women, but America as a whole benefited from, seeing as alcoholism and domestic violence riddled our underdeveloped country. So these women of early America that drove the race for prohibition may have just saved us today from a life where alcoholism ruled the country and women still had no rights.